Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Um, my name is Natalie Léger, and I'm going to be presenting with Danielle. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Danielle, and we're excited to have you with us.
Yes, so I'm Natalie Léger. I'm a doctoral candidate at Springfield College in the S.E.A.T program in counseling psychology. I'm excited to be here today. Danielle and I are both on the Collaborative Council for S.E.A.T at the Table event. And we're really excited and inspired by how this week has been going so far, and even just the planning process for this. So we're really happy to be here. And we're excited to be talking about a really cool topic that's close to both Danielle and I, and that's related to the intersection of social justice, politics, and sport. And before we get started on anything, we just want to give everyone a heads up that this session will be recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can feel free to, turn off your video. But we want to make sure that people have access to this later on, whether it's for accessibility reasons or otherwise. So we just want to put that out there. Also, as you go through this presentation, we are going to have time at the end for some discussion and some questions. So if things come to mind throughout the presentation, feel free to enter a question into the chat space. And then our lovely friend Rob is going to be keeping tabs on that for us. So if you have preferred pronouns or a preferred name that might not be the same as what's listed on Zoom for you, feel free to write that along with your question inside the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, there'll be a feedback form that'll be put into the chat for like a link for people to fill out, just so that we can get some feedback on how this event's been going and this presentation in particular. So with all that being said, we can get started here. So like I said today, the big goal is to be talking about the intersection of social justice, politics, and sport. And really what I want to demonstrate today and what Danielle and I want for all of you to take away is how this intersection exists and how it cannot be separated. And we want to leave you all with tools for preventing the dehumanization of athletes and making it incredibly clear the level of power that we all have as people who are connected to sport in some sort of way. So without further ado, let's get started here. As I was putting together this presentation, I came across this quote by Nelson Mandela about the power of sport. And just to read it here for everybody, the sport has the power to change the world, has the power to inspire, it has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair. It is more powerful than government in breaking down racial barriers. So I think for all of us here who may be connected to sport in some sort of way, whether it's being an athlete yourself, coach, administrator, whoever, this potential power of sport is probably something you've heard about before. The way it builds character in people and can unite us and inspire us to be better. But the one issue I have with this quote is the amount of power that it gives to sport itself, when in fact what we know is that at the end of the day, none of this happens without the people. None of this goes without the athletes and the people who make sport run. Sport by itself doesn't magically change the world. It doesn't magically unite us or inspire us. A basketball game or a football game cannot do that. It's the people who make sport happen who allow us to make these transformational changes. And unless we're thinking about this in an intentional and purposeful way, we're just going to continue to lie to ourselves and lie to each other about the power that sport has. And we need to make sure that we're focusing on the people who make sport happen at the end of the day, because that's what makes these changes happen. So let's take a look at the actual people who make sport run. And we're going to take a look specifically in college sport as well as professional sport, because that's really the mainstream context for which we think about sport. We're not thinking about our niece Susan's little lacrosse game on the weekends. When we think about sport, we think about college football, college basketball, and professional sports leagues. So if we look at college football, the players themselves, majority Black. Same college basketball, majority Black, while the coaches remain overwhelmingly white. Similarly, if we look at the NBA context, athletes, majority Black, go to the NFL, athletes again, majority Black. And if we take a look at how these demographics influence the intersection of sport and politics, let's look no further than the current times we're living in when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on college athletics, and particularly when it comes to college football. And if you've noticed, if you follow with the news or even just college football in general, the one conference that gets talked about the most when it comes to this conference can't shut down, we need to get back in playing, the schools need to be running when it comes to college football, it's the Big Ten. And that's for a particular reason. And if we take a look at the major institutions within the Big Ten, Penn State, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, we look at these institutions that make up the Big Ten with huge football programs, multi-million-dollar programs, massive budgets. These dollar amounts are the amount of money that each of not only these institutions would lose, but the cities for which these institutions exist within, how much money they would lose if the Big Ten said we are not playing, which was their initial intention because of the safety of the players. But they've now reversed that and they are playing. But if you look at this, State College, $130 million, Ann Arbor, Michigan, $122 million, Madison, Wisconsin, $16 million per home game, Iowa City, Iowa, $14.5 million, Lincoln, Nebraska, $12 million per home game. And the reason why people in power and politics want to be addressing the Big Ten in particular, because Pac-12 out west said we weren't playing, Big East said we weren't playing initially, and there was no qualms there. But the reason why the Big Ten is the biggest talking point across the country is because if we look at demographically, whether it's culturally or economically, what these 5 towns, small American towns, what the demographic breakdown is. And if you notice, all of these 5 towns where these big football institutions lie are predominantly made up of white working class, blue collar individuals. And these small American towns that are predominantly made up of white working collar individuals, working class individuals, their whole economies are based off of the backs of Black and brown students who are making $0. And what this creates is this false narrative that when Black and brown individuals are speaking up for their well-being and talking about things that are unjust, which in this case is we don't want to play in an unsafe environment because of our health and our family's health, it creates this false narrative that when Black and brown people have a voice and are able to stand up for themselves, that comes to the detriment of white working class individuals. And if we take a step back and look into how this plays out in general politics, away from sport, if you just happen to think about things through this lens, we take a look at this snippet of a piece from The Atlantic and also CBS News. It speaks about how the white working class over time has been a shrinking class when it comes to size over the past 40 years. And the way that people in power and politics speak about why this shrinking is happening is because of a combination of factors: demographic, economic, and cultural changes. And more specifically, because there's increased number of employees who are minorities, high rates of education, higher professional classes of other individuals. And that's the reason why the white working class has entered this quote unquote death of despair. That's why they have a rise in deaths due to drug overdoses. And that's why they have higher rates of suicide. When in fact, what we know is that even that first sentence in this snippet here is living off of a false narrative that white working class individuals are the backbone of the US economy. When in fact, what we know similarly to the Big Ten is that the US economy has always been based off the back of enslaved Black and brown individuals who make no money and don't get to live off of the profits of their work. So what does this narrative create when we create situations where we have this discourse between Black and brown individuals as well as white individuals? Is that it creates a suspicion of others and this fear of other people, that if these other individuals seem to be doing better than me, or they're having a more just life and well-being, that comes to the detriment of white individuals. And if we go back into the Big Ten, we can see how this narrative is so harmful to us. And we can look no further than another institution in the Big Ten, which is Northwestern. Same region, Midwest, Big Ten, massive multi-million-dollar football program in Evanston, Illinois. And yes, they are losing a substantial amount of money as well because of the pandemic and lack of ticket sales. But it's nowhere near to the economic downfall for their city's budget compared to these other institutions. Why is that? Because Northwestern is a northern Chicago suburb that has an economy that's diverse enough that it doesn't heavily rely on Northwestern athletics to survive. And what this means is that the more diverse and inclusive environments and communities that we have, even in the most devastating economic crisis that we're having as a country, we are safer, and our diversity acts as a protective factor. But because we've allowed for, and people in power and politics have allowed for, communities to continue to thrive off of Black and brown people who make no money, and creating this false narrative of hate between the two, we've gotten to the situation where we're not safe, economically, physically, whatever it is. So how did this happen? How did we get to this point where it was so hard for us to see how our diversity equals our strength and power? And one of the main contributing factors to this is dehumanization. Dehumanization is the denial of full humanness in others and the cruelty and suffering that accompanies it. A practical definition refers to it as the viewing and treatment of other persons as though they lack the mental capacities that are commonly attributed to human beings. And what happens here is that we stop seeing each other as human beings. We stop seeing each other as people with the same problems we have. They don't have life stories. And anything good, healthy, beneficial that's going on with other individuals mean that it's a slight against me, that it's bad for me. And when we stop seeing each other as human beings who are just trying to get by and live healthy lives just like the rest of us, it's much easier for us to be separated and divided by people in power and manipulated in a way to where we become less safe. So how does this come about in athletics? And this is the pattern for which this happens. First, what happens is that people become a product. So we start seeing athletes as an asset, as something that can get traded and manipulated just like stocks and bonds. So when you see in professional sport an athlete get traded, it gets thought about as, oh, this is just a business. We don't see the humanness behind an individual having to pack their whole family, leave town, ditch a house that maybe they loved. Their child has to leave the school and friends maybe they loved, and now has to go live in a hotel room for probably the next 3 months before they can find a new home. Then what happens is the skills and knowledge of athletes become undervalued. And you've probably heard this in ways when, if you listen to any commentary in a sporting event and the commentators are talking about, oh, he's a beast in the paint or a monster on the field, whatever it is, instead of, oh, this individual actually has a superior level of intelligence to be able to see the trajectory of the ball hit the backboard and align themselves in a particular way to get a rebound. No, it's much less. It's a magical thing to where they're a beast, they're a monster, and that's why they're good. It's not a tangible skill and intelligence that this person has developed. Then what happens is that the powers that be are the ones who decide the worth of these athletes and not actually what they're producing, whether in revenue or overall power and wellness in society. But what athletes get in return is, oh, don't worry, you have all these accolades, fame. We send you on that basketball tournament to Maui and you get all these sweatsuits. You know, you have your scholarship, big salary, you're making a ton of money. Like, you should have no concerns in life. And make sure, before you forget, you're not actually doing hard work. You're just playing a game. I don't know about you folks. We got a lot of people on this call right now. I don't know about you, but I've never played a game where if me and my friends decided to stop playing because we didn't feel safe or comfortable, that my whole city lost $130 million. That's never happened to me. So again, through all of this, how we avoid getting in the situation of this cycle and not being cogs in the machine of this dehumanizing cycle from happening is focusing on the athletes and the people who make sport happen. And it's our jobs as people who are connected to sport, whether you're an athlete, coach, administrator, parent, whoever, if you're a fan of sport even, we need to be thinking about sport in an intentional and purposeful way. And we need to be doing the work day to day to make sure that we're aware of these systems that are existing in sport. Because if there's anything we've seen, even over the course of this pandemic, is that even the leagues that exist in a literal bubble are still subject to these issues. So what do we do about it? Because I want to make sure we have tangible things that we can walk away with, even with this really big message that we're talking about here right now. So actually in practice, on a macro and a micro level here, on the macro level, we need to be supporting legislation and policy that allow athletes to be compensated what they're actually worth and express themselves freely. Right now, we know NCAA is really not doing well in both of those categories. Professional leagues are suppressing people's voices when it comes to when you can protest or when you can speak up even. Even if you look at trade clauses and in the NCAA transfer clauses, where if an athlete's unhappy with their location, they have to get permission from the coach and the AD before they can even talk to another school, let alone then have to wait a year in football before they can start playing again at the other institution. That's not being able to express yourself freely. Then even in the International Olympic Committee, there's still a policy on the books now in the bylaws stating that you cannot protest on the podium stage. This is in complete conflict with what we're talking about here. Another thing is that we need to be able to diversify the economies of small American towns. The reason why a place like Northwestern is able to be more diverse is because an area like Chicago has better addressed issues of racism and white supremacy in the workplace and community to foster inclusion and safety versus some of these majority white working class towns where Black and brown people do not feel safe moving to those areas. It's much cheaper to live in those areas. It's not an issue of finance, but when you think about even issues of redlining, Black and brown people getting poor interest rates on mortgages in those predominantly white areas, you're not going to be able to diversify these economies until those broader systemic injustices are dealt with and until racism and white supremacy are eradicated from these communities. Then we're going to be stuck in this situation where we can continue to be divided by people in power in the ways at which we've been talking about. Then on the micro level, if we think about what you can even do right after this meeting, is adapting the vocabulary for how one describes an athlete. I get it. It's fun to say, oh, he's a beast, or I'm a beast, I'm a monster, whatever it is when it comes to being an athlete. I've done it as an athlete. I'm sure most of us have. And I'm sure even athletes out there have done it. But we need to be better at putting the humanness back into the athlete. And language is one of the powerful ways that we can do that. Another thing is making sure that if you're working around athletes in any sort of way, that we're increasing opportunities for athletes to be heard. And this doesn't just mean setting up some committees and meetings to deal with racism and social justice, whatever it is on campus. We need to, one, yes, you can do that, but we need to see action because then we're just gaslighting one another. We need to see action about the lessons learned. I want you to then go document it and then share it with other institutions in the area. We got to keep that competitive stuff on the field. When it comes to dealing with these issues of social injustices and racial injustices, we need to be sharing what works so we can be fostering bigger and better communities. And part of the way you can do that even on a local level is getting more connected within the community you work within. A lot of these bigger institutions, even at Springfield, we sit within our little bubble of the few blocks of our institutions. And we need to make sure that we're getting connected, whether it's with local high schools, youth sport teams, whatever it is, because if we're coming together as a collective community versus just our one institution, we can then better speak to the people in power and demonstrate our coalition of what we want and make that push forward in actual legislation and policy. Then, if you think about yourself, we need to be pushing ourselves to be more empathic towards athletes. If you're sitting here through this and being like, nope, Natalie, like these people make way too much money, they have all these scholarships, like they're the cool kids on campus, I don't really care about this. I want you to really sit and question why you have those sort of thoughts about athletes. And why is it that it's so hard to see the humanness behind that individual? And really ask yourself and other people around you why it's so challenging for you to see an athlete as another human being who experiences problems just like you do and is just trying to get by and live a healthy life. And through all of this, we need to be more intentional. If there's anything that I hope all of you take away from this discussion, is that we need to be intentional in how we speak about sport. We have to stop pretending like sport just happens in this isolated bubble and that we just get to be the cool kids around athletes all the time. It can't happen. And when I think about this quote, again, it all falls and boils down to the people at the end of the day. And the more that we can keep that in mind, the better off we'll be. And at the end of the day, this is a team sport. Change is a team sport. And we have to work together to get this done. If you saw that list that I had up with the in-practice things that we can do, and you thought, whoa, Natalie, this is way too much for me, I can't handle all this. Damn straight you can't. We need to find our community, and just like with the team sport, you have to find your role. If you're a coach, you've heard that before. If you're an athlete, you've heard that before. Find your role in this fight so we can build a better place for the athletes and the people who work within sport, so that we can finally meet our actual potential for the power of what sport can be. Well, that's all I got. But we're gonna go into a brief discussion, and if people have questions coming up, then Rob will help us out and interject with those questions. But yes, Danielle, what you got for me?
Natalie, that presentation is great. Natalie put the presentation together, and I'm here as a sort of a backboard. And as one thing I definitely came away with in that last bit about finding your role, this presentation actually models what I think is one really important thing about this particular presentation and just in general, that for those of us who are identify as white and want to be helpful and want to promote social justice, I think sometimes finding your role is sitting back and being a bystander and finding ways to speak up and speak out, but also knowing when it's okay to sit back and let the people who experience certain situations really speak out. And so, that really hits home to me in terms of making sure that we understand you can be really, really impactful and not actually have be at the top of the podium, so to speak, in terms of being an athlete. You don't always have to come in first, and you don't always have to be the first to speak, and you don't always have to be there. But sometimes your role might be, might be not that first person out. I played basketball also growing up, and so anyone that's played basketball knows that that sixth person really off the bench can be one of the most critical players on the team. And anyone that's played any kind of team sport knows that everyone on the team really makes the team. Every time you're at practice, if you're not the one playing in the game, you're the one that trained all the people that are playing in the game. If you were at practice and you worked hard and you played against other people. So I think that thinking about social justice and supporting our athletes and seeing them as human factors, those pieces are really critical to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up a great point too about, because we're people who exist within sport, and whether we're former athletes or coaches, administrators, we have that mindset of wanting to be competitive and wanting to compete all the time. And I even had that myself as somebody who's a psychologist in training. Like, it's something that I have to unwind And I think when we work, we're trying to find ways to work together to help one another and achieve these messages of social justice within sport. We have to check ourselves in those times where, is this my athlete mind working? Or is this something to where like I can truly be helping individuals in the way that they need to be helped without feeling like I have to be the one to do it?
Mm-hmm. The other thing, this, to get even more micro for this presentation in terms of thinking about our roles specifically on the Springfield College campus, I know I've heard in a lot of the sessions that happened over the summer about social justice from our student athletes of color, really hitting home that humanization piece and helping make sure, and again, anyone who's ever been an athlete knows, oh, you're the soccer player, like that was me in college. Oh, you're on the soccer team. It's like, well, yeah, I have a whole lot of other things going on, but yes, I happen to also be on the soccer team. So I think from what I've heard from our undergraduate population in particular is that our students of color really feel that heavily, and that the ones that are athletes, that's their pigeonhole, that's their role, and they're the athletes. And then the ones that aren't athletes, it sounds like get this overwhelming sensation of like, well, why are you even here? Like, how did you get here? Why would you be here? Like it just it just doesn't make sense in other students' brains of like, why would you even be on this campus? You must be on the track and field team, or you must be on the football team. So I think that's another element of that humanization of our student body in general, is really understanding that, we have some amazing students on this campus, and they are all here for one purpose, and that's a Springfield College education. And the rest is just extra benefits that we get from having them on campus. And that also feeds into your point of the more diverse our community is, and the more we see each individual element of somebody's diversity, the stronger we are going to be and the better we're going to be able to support ourselves. So in terms of taking your amazing global presentation and really shrinking it down to our campus needs, I think that's a huge piece that we need to really stay focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, as somebody who specializes in sports psychology, that's really the concern that most athletes are coming in right now, are these issues of athlete identity and feeling like they don't even know themselves outside of athletics, let alone what the people in their lives see them as. And that's a really confusing process where you go 18, 19, 20 years even, not knowing anything about yourself. I mean, I've asked athletes, oh, how do you introduce yourself to someone without saying what sport you play? And they're frozen. They can't even say, oh, I'm a nice person, or I'm funny, I make good friends, like things like that. It's very hard to do. And I think as one way that we can support people within athletics is pushing and asking the athletes you work with, like, hey, tell me something else about yourself. Like, I'd love to learn who you are, even outside of this space, because that's going to make them a better athlete at the end of the day. And the reason why that is because if an athlete is only connected to their athlete identity, when they fail in sport, which is inevitable to happen, we all make mistakes in sport. That's what sport is. It's about who makes the least mistakes. That's who's the best. But when an athlete makes a mistake, and if their identity is so close to athletics, then they start to feel like a failure. Where if you can diversify their identity into other outlets and aspects of their life and ecosystem, then if they fail in athletics one night, it's not so catastrophic anymore, because they have all of these other elements in their life that bring them joy, bring them feeling of achievement, success, and happiness. That, okay, yeah, like I didn't have a good game that night, but that's not who I am. I'm not a failure.
Mm-hmm. There's a comment.
Yeah, Dr. Deandra, do you have I see you raising your hand there. I think you're on mute, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
This has been a great day in the Office of Multicultural Affairs with other allies. Need to be continuously congratulated for this historic event, week long. I sat in on a number of presentations. By far, your presentation has been the most stimulating and inspirational, as well as to outline the comprehensive macro, micro level. And I saw President Cooper here a minute ago. I wanted to raise my hand earlier, but she's not there because I want to briefly state something that I want to invite you, Natalie, and other people who are attending this important presentation, a gift. I think most of us would agree that Springfield College is a good place. What you have done tonight is challenge us to think how can become greater still in terms of our mission and impact. The macro system contributions and factors you outlined are really important and supported by the macro. I tend to think of the big tent. Micro things are needed, but the macro level is the payoff, right, for what's going on. I have recently been invited by Dr. William Parham, the keynote speaker for Humanics last year, who is a colleague and a brother beloved, who recently was named the first director of the NBA, the National Basketball Association Mental Health Program. His ties are far-reaching, not only among the players in the NBA, but with the owners. Dr. Parham asked me if I could put together a design for the Hall of Fame basketball center downtown. And in doing so, he said, Michael, we're at an apex in our history with the rise of the multiracial protests going on. The protest against police violence and the tragic deaths of George Floyd and other people whose names are countless going on. He said, Michael, I spoke with LeBron James the other day, and he said, we've got to do some more creative things going on. And I ran it by LeBron. And we need to do something with the Hall of Fame that can add an extension, looking at the history. And there is a rich history there, going back to the Globetrotters in basketball, focusing in on social justice issues. So he's invited me to put together a plan and to talk with key people down at the Hall of Fame. And I was going to ask Dr. Cooper, but I think she's left tonight, if we could set up a meeting with you, Natalie, myself, Dr. Cooper, and anyone who is part of this presentation tonight who would like to join. Because I'd like to do this not as an individual, but spearheaded by a Springfield College endeavor, putting together a historic, the first time an athletic Hall of Fame would put together documentation from the past and the present with key speakers like LeBron James and Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley and other people who could help educate the general public as they come in and learn about the All-Stars. Dr. Parham was saying, Michael, I want you to keep in mind, we really want to make this educational, like interactive, so when the kids come in, they push a button and they hear LeBron talking about something and they're engaged in something. So this has been put on my plate. I want to put it on our plate, Natalie. I want to meet with the president. I want to meet with you. I want to talk about a gift to Springfield College to make it an international, a keystone in the nation's athletic. And I want to use your macro system so we can call the state legislators together for the inauguration when we get this social justice component at the Hall of Fame there. We have the potential with your guidance to make Springfield College stand out as an illuminating force for social justice and athletic excellence. I wonder if you or if anyone else here has any comments or suggestions, because I'm going to move forward. This is not about me. This is about us. And in particular, this is about you, Natalie, for what you put together here tonight. I'd really be interested in getting any kind of comments. Wait a minute, I see Calvin Hill there. Calvin, I need your help. I don't want this to be about me. I want this to be about us. We have an opportunity to engage in a historic event at the Hall of Fame.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for that comment. And I will share with everyone that we're actually already in that process. Marty Dobrow and myself have actually got a meeting that we have tomorrow with members of the Hall of Fame, and we're working on right now a traveling exhibit and some concepts with them to do exactly as you're processing and talking about. And it's going to be starting by working with their board of trustees all the way down. So I invite both you and Natalie to come in and meet with myself and Marty so that we can continue to move the process forward.
Well, that's real.
Absolutely.
These presentations are real good because William Parham is moving ahead with it. So rather than have antagonistic forces, we need to kind of come together. And
absolutely.
So when we have people like LeBron in our corner and Shaquille O'Neal, we need to put some pressure on the trustees at the Hall of Fame. What time is your meeting tomorrow?
Hey, Michael, and Calvin, I'm so sorry, but I really want to get back to this presentation and the Q&A about this presentation. And actually, I do have to, so if you guys can have that conversation, and if Natalie wants to hop in on that, which I really hope she does because her presentation rocked. But I really want to get back to the Q&A. And I do want to say one comment before we get back to any other questions, actually, in terms of your work, one bit about your work with the Hall of Fame, it did remind me, in your comments, we didn't have time to, Natalie and I talked about this and we didn't have time to, but one thing that is very glaring about this presentation, and it's a whole nother ball of wax and a whole nother presentation, we're only talking about male athletes. And even in your conversations about the Hall of Fame, if I can have one nugget for you all, women play basketball. So in this presentation, and that's not to knock what we've done here tonight, that was purposeful because that's really what the focus is. Those are really what the numbers are. And this is a very important conversation in and of itself, what we did here tonight. But in the global context of humanization and athletics, and especially when we're talking about the Basketball Hall of Fame, there have been some amazing contributions by women athletes, and I hope that's not forgotten for that conversation. But I want to get back to this conversation, and if anyone has any comments or questions, one thing we did really want to weave in our presentation with how can we take this to Alden Street, and how can we help work with the folks that we have here to make a sustainable future for our student athletes and those that work with them.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways to, tie together like this whole conversation, and even what you're bringing up, Dr. DeAndrea, is with sport, we have to not forget, like, there is a power to what's cool, like within society, like literally what is cool. And right now we're in a time where sport has been cool for a really long time, but now being engaged in social justice is becoming cool. And we need to, that's a form of power and privilege that we have, because now we're in the mainstream when it comes to the people who are connected and are related to sport in some sort of way. And we have to be able to use our voices and the power that we have during this time and not take it for granted, because there is a lot of pushing that we can be doing right now. And like you were talking about, Danielle, as athletes walk around this campus, there's a lot of weight and power that they have. And we need to be able to support that power for the greater community, as well as for the individuals themselves.
Natalie, one question in the comments from Kirby is if you came across graduation rate information, and that is a huge factor in terms of college athletics and thinking about college athletes as a product as opposed to, why they're actually on a college campus to get a degree. Did you come across that information in your research?
Not in particular for this presentation, but just kind of almost anecdotally and also through other presentations I've done in the past. It's different across sports, and particularly when you look at college football, that's probably the area where it's been slightly increasing, but it's been fairly stagnant, in part because of the rules for how many years you have to stay within college before you can go for the NFL draft. And that's been bumped up to 3 years now. So for the most part, individuals are then getting their degree, because even if they do leave early, it's only really a year of classes left that they have to do. So that's been slightly improving. But I can get back to you, Kirby. I'll text you after this when I find that. But yeah, that's definitely something really interesting to take a look at, because it absolutely plays a role into the money that comes into college athletics. Because for me, when I think about something like the one and done rule, which predominantly affects college basketball and particularly men's college basketball, is that if the institutions were really looking to have athletes stay for longer and not just cash out on like the hot stars for the 1 year, they would be doing everything in their power to pay them so that they would stay for an additional year or two. The school would then profit more. If Zion Williamson had to stay at Duke for 2 years because the school was going to pay him $150,000 anyway, there would have been a higher probability that he would have stayed and Duke would have continued to make a lot of money. So there's something fishy going on there, for why really they don't want to pay these individuals and whether they think they're worth it or not.
Thank you so much. I did have a question that wanted to be answered anonymously, so I'll go ahead and read that.
Yeah.
So it was said earlier that professional athletes are not always allowed to protest by their organizations. As the Olympics, for an example, with not being able to protest on the podium. The question is that not the same as working for any company? If your boss tells you not to protest, you're not going to protest unless you are willing to face the consequences. Being a pro athlete is the same as working for any other business. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And if so, is the dehumanization seen in more places than just athletics?
The answer is yes to that second one, with dehumanization. But when it comes to this idea of, okay, well, it's a similar situation of the workplace versus when it comes to professional athletics and your ability to protest, I would say that both are a suppression of people's voices and a way to continue to oppress people. Because there's a reason why unions have formed in this country. It's so that people can speak as a collective together, and have money and voice and people power in order for change to happen. So technically a union is a form of protest. And that's something people have been attempting to suppress during this time as well. So for me, yes, they are one and the same. But the fact that the quote unquote owners and business people want to use that as a way to suppress one another, I think is the more inappropriate thing.
I also just wanted to clarify, it sounded like in that question there was the clarification that the Olympic Committee, in terms of not allowing protests, and that Olympians are considered amateur athletes. More recently, and Natalie probably knows more of the details of this, some athletes that play professionally in their countries are allowed to compete in the Olympics, but traditionally it has been reserved. So that's not as much you're representing your home country, not a workplace. And then, because it sounded like the question sort of dealt with the Olympic Committee, but then also into the NFL and true professional athletic organizations, which those clearly are workplaces. And I think that intersection has been heavily hit in terms of, trying to curtail the opinions, the collective opinions of athletes, while also expecting a high level of entertainment from them on any given day.
Right. Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, that connection with the IOC in particular, because at least, I don't know about other countries, but at least in the United States, when it comes to the U.S. Olympic Committee, the individual athletes, they're not necessarily professionals or amateurs, and they don't necessarily work for the U.S. Olympic Committee. They're kind of deemed as like this special contractor situation because they don't have any sort of ties or benefits to the USOC. And the USOC actually pays them very little in order to compete. And I actually highly recommend that people check out this documentary that I think was produced by Michael Phelps called The Weight of Gold, that digs into some of these issues related to, one, mental health when it comes to these Olympians, but also just their overall quality of life and how poorly the USOC treats them. And the ability for them to do that is because they're not actually employees of the U.S. Olympic Committee. But they're still in some ways bound to their rights, very similar to the NCAA, really.
Thank you. And we do have another question in the chat, and that is kind of drawing comparisons between academic services and study services to athletics and mentorship through sports. So in the library, there are often open community hours, and the question is, does the Springfield College offer similar services in our sports complex? The person who typed out the question said that this could be a really great connection to build community and address our humanics in our everyday approach.
Danielle, do you have a better idea of this one?
I believe that the community is welcome on the track when it's not being used by our athletes for practices and things. I don't believe there are open community hours within the wellness center, because I think that that's seen as a benefit to students, staff, and faculty to use that as part of the Springfield College community. But I believe that the track is open for walking and use when not in use for college sanctioned events. I do know that, kind of through my own work on the campus, I do know that the PE department has been running during COVID, has been running a homeschool physical education class on Fridays for community members, so that our master's level physical education teachers can get some experience in a classroom without being in a classroom. And so those kinds of ways, I think the college works really hard to find ways to bring community members to campus. And I think Dr. Hill is still on the call. I think his department does a lot of work in terms of getting community onto campus for different events.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you so much. Absolutely. We've got work through, obviously, Special Olympics, where we have Special Olympics on campus over the summer. We've also hosted the Massachusetts Senior Games, which is an opportunity for individuals my age to continue to participate in sport, as well as opportunities for, children with disabilities and accessibility issues to use, both the swimming complex, as well as the volleyball complex. And then obviously, the work that we do with the community with allowing them to use both the track and field as well as the tennis courts when they're not used over the course of the summer.
And
yeah, go ahead, Rob.
I just wanted to also give credit to our athletics department, because all of the teams do work in different capacities with the city of Springfield to help deliver that humanics in action approach to the city of Springfield and other larger communities. So that is, at least in theory, we are trying our hardest to disseminate all of that humanics philosophy out into the greater community to make sure that, we're not just sitting in the city of Springfield, but we're also serving the community as well. And the athletic departments and individual coaches and student athletes do really help with that as well.
And I do think there's a way through activities and programming just like that we can continue to build on this more humanizing message when it comes to how we look at athletes, and also how athletes can engage in the community, and relating it back to athletes' identity as well, of making it broader and more diverse and just more accessible. I think when it comes to how athletes are connecting, being able to do it in an intentional way, and whether that's coaches and after those events, not just having everybody disperse, but maybe having coaches and administrators engage in some sort of reflection when it comes to these events that they're having with the community. Because we don't want to get in the situation of there's just kind of this saviorism complex that's going on. But we want to make sure that those communities and even mentorship, which can be incredibly powerful, particularly within the athlete community, that's actually taking place too. Okay, so was there any other questions that people have? We have a little bit of time left. Just before people drop out of this call, just remember to fill out that feedback form that Rob put in the chat, please. You can just click out the link and then fill that out pretty briefly. Yeah, is there any stuff people want to either drop in the chat or kind of just pop up?
So there was one last question that I got sent to me that I would like to be asked anonymously.
Yeah.
And that is your opinion, Natalie, on the 5-star basketball recruit McCord Maker committing to Howard University. And if you think that that is a sign or any type, if it shows any inclination as to a future trend or pathway for the recruitment process and how student athletes are making their college choices and decisions.
Yeah. I think that was when I saw that news break, I think one, I was excited for the visibility that the HBCUs would be getting because of that. And then number two, it made me really think about how these young athletes at like 16, 17, 18 years old are more self-aware and more conscious than ever when it comes to what they want out of these major institutions. And being aware of that the power lies within themselves at a younger age than we've really ever seen before. And that was really what I got excited about when I saw that announcement come out. Because, he knows he's probably going to be in and out of there in a year or two, maybe. But to be able to, one, bring that visibility to Howard and other HBCUs, but to also know that within that year or two, the level of identity development that he can have in that space versus going to another institution that may just kind of treat him as an asset, really showed to me that him and other young people in athletics are really getting that in their minds of they're the ones with the real power here. And I hope things like that continue. What I also hope continues is that more high school athletes start, particularly for men's basketball, start going into the G League and just cash out immediately so that it forces the NCAA to start paying the athletes in the first place. Because if these athletes are starting to be able to just skip college altogether because they're just being taken advantage of at the end of the day, and they're able to make $100,000, $200,000 for their family, I'm all for it.
Mm-hmm.